Want your brand to be seen and be remembered? Effective campaigns need both. JC.co's high-quality billboard sites in premium locations nationwide offer brands powerful and visible stages for emotive, impactful and influential storytelling. Find out how JC.co can help your brand be seen and be remembered at www.beseenberemembered.co.nz. Nau mai hoki mai ki a The Fold, e mihi nei ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest today is Gareth Shute, who is a musician, but also a music writer and latterly a music historian who has written a book that's out now called Songs from the Shaky Isles, A Short History of Popular Music in New Zealand, which is very much the kind of thing which I get quite excited about. And as he says on the podcast, there's now an increasingly large sort of bibliography of books which go deep on niches within New Zealand. I read, for example, a few years ago, there's a whole book just about How Bizarre, and it's fantastic, by Simon Gregg, and I recommend it. But there's something about having a global view that attempts, I think successfully, to sort of draw in every thread that gives you a sense of the scale and sweep and all the kind of different sort of genres and scenes and bands and artists which ultimately kind of make up this big unruly thing that we call New Zealand music. Because some of these stories are very well known and told to the point of being familiar to most people, and others you'd completely forget about. And I think that what Gareth does with this is even though it kind of just romps by and, there might be 4 paragraphs on the Feelers and 4 paragraphs on Lord, you get a sense of everything that has gone on here and what's driven the kind of changes in what we've kind of released and how we sound. The role that radio played in kind of resisting at times the development and artistry of New Zealand music, the weird barriers to entry that both record stores in the 50s and TV in the 60s and 70s represented to probably original New Zealand music. And then the way that the arrival of things like New Zealand On Air or student radio, the impact they had on just allowing for different types of music to be kind of brought to different audiences. So rather than try and encapsulate everything that's in the book, which would clearly be impossible, what I've done with this conversation is pick the eyes out of the moments where our music coincided with changes to distribution in particular and to different media forms. And it shows you just how powerful those things have been in terms of shaping the kinds of music we make, how popular it got, and how far it could go both within our shores and beyond them. So this is Gareth Shute on The Fold. Kia ora, Gareth. Welcome to The Fold.
Kia ora.
I wonder if you could start by introducing yourself, because I feel like there's sort of 2 sides to your relationship with music, and they're both kind of very relevant to this assignment. One more than the other, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I've been writing about New Zealand music for over 20 years as a music journalist, and then over the last 10 years more as a music historian, I suppose. But at the same time, I've been playing in bands, and I was around for the beginning of Little Chief Records and was a volunteer, and now I'm a part-time employee of the label. So, yeah, I toured overseas in some of those bands, like the Brunettes and the Ruby Sons back in those days. And, yeah, I've written sort of 3 or 4 books on New Zealand music before, written for most of the music publications and mostly write for Audio Culture these days. So, yeah, 2 sides. I'm always writing about it and then thinking, I can't annoy that person, I'm going to play with that band or whatever.
Yeah, and you've got to sort of figure out how to put the bands that you're most closely associated with it. That they need to be in there, but not too high in the mix. So that's New Zealand, though. It's conflicts everywhere. I wonder if you could start by just sort of telling me about the origins of this book, Songs from the Shaky Isles, A Short History of Popular Music in New Zealand. The scope is almost overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, I just saw all these books getting more and more specific to the point where someone could write a massive book on the first 8 years of flying nun or something. And I just thought, oh my God, someone's got to put this all in perspective. Like, you can't see the wood for the trees at all. Like, you just need that very high level view. And then you can see all these interesting sort of currents that happen over a longer period that get obscured when you're looking at such tiny details. So I just, luckily I've been, writing about New Zealand music for 20 years. So I had that perspective. And as it's come closer to present, I've dug deeper and deeper into the history and become more interested in that pre-rock and roll period even. And so, it's really, I finally got to write this book that sort of encompassed it all, I suppose.
I want to kind of pick on a few threads that come up without it, because it's basically a nice way of talking about the form and what propelled it over the thick end of a century. There's a character at the start who's kind of amazing and speaks to just how sort of unformed and kind of entrepreneurial the nascent industry was in the 30s, and that's Tex Morden. Could you sort of tell me about him and that sort of carnivalesque that he embodied in terms of that early period?
Yeah, I mean, he was just this figure, in those very early days, you just had to go out and play. And so he loved country music. And so he just started busking and running away from home, even from like 15 years old. And then he'd just get up, like a jazz band would be playing, like Epi Chalfoun's jazz band, which is the first jazz band to record in New Zealand. He jumped up and would play songs with them. He'd play songs anywhere. And then he was finally like, oh, the scene in Australia is so much bigger though. So he moved over there. One thing he did before he left was actually record one of the first recordings of country music outside the US. People say it might be the first because he did this wax cylinder very early on. But then he went to Australia and he just went around kind of like a hobo on the different trains and working for the circuses. Similar to what Prince Tuiteka did later, actually. It's kind of weird how that all entertainment was kind of combined in that weird way.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that because you also had the Māori show bands who had a lot of success in Australia and sometimes further afield during that era. And it feels like it was about a night out. And if you could you were putting on a show rather than sort of playing a set, is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, Tex Morden kind of just used his ability to move around with the circus to like play shows and then play on the radio, and then he became a country star. But when he did that, he did have more of a whole show with a magician and stuff, and towards the end he was sharpshooting things off people's heads and stuff as part of his show.
Motorcycle, had like rail carriages. It's amazingly evocative.
He learned every type of entertainment possible. And then, as you say, with the Maori show bands, it was just Rotorua was such a centre for Maori traditional music, but then they were this influence of Western music was coming in this way of singing in a light operatic kind of style that was popular at that time. And so Maori songwriters realized, we can do a little bit of that as well. We can make a bigger show and we could take it around the country. And so from being a Rotorua specific thing, it started to be a like touring circuit where these Maori show bands would come. I mean, they were touring parties first when it was the big ensemble, but then they started getting these smaller ensembles that were more like the show band that playing popular music, but then doing Maori waiata as well and stuff. So it was all about entertaining.
Thinking about there's a tension in it, in that I think HMV had a very profound presence on the sale of recorded music, and at the same time had sort of almost no interest in creating any or selling any. Is that right? Yeah.
It's funny to reflect back on that time because on one way, there were a lot populations and audiences in New Zealand were quite taken by New Zealand performers because you had to go out and see a live show. There wasn't really TV and stuff early on, and there was a bit of radio, but radio would all be mostly bands playing and stuff. But then at the same time, there was this kind of awkwardness of not believing in ourselves and stuff. And so HMV was the big company who sold all the record players and the imported records, and they just didn't think there was any point doing New Zealand musicians, to the point where, they had to start a label, Tanza, to assist New Zealand artists to even record the first New Zealand recorded and written single, which was Blue Smoke.
So, I mean, there is a kind of dichotomy there in that people were making a living playing dozens of shows up and down the country. So there was clearly an audience demand for it. And yet, in terms of the recording and distribution and the kind of music industry, recorded music industry as we know it now, it really had to fight to exist at all. So I guess, we've been talking about that kind of radio and live era and early recording, but there's a really interesting section where you talk about the role that TV played in the, I don't know, we'd probably consider them fairly schmaltzy singers now. They were big stars in the 60s, but it felt like because there were no music videos, but music was really popular. Do I understand it right? And I think there are shows like Happen In, really corny name, and Studio One, where they would come up and just sing the hits of the day and become big stars in their own right, but essentially as just giving voice to and performing sort of these almost standards that were coming in from overseas.
Yeah, I mean, that was the weird thing about that super monoculture of the time, was that on one hand, you had these New Zealand performers who could make a living being musicians because they were on TV and then they could tour around the country. But then they weren't allowed to write their own music. When Ray Columbus did an album of originals with his band, The Invaders, no one wanted to know about that. Everyone just wanted them to cover overseas hits. And because you could record them and release them before the originals even arrived here, you could often just beat the market for these big overseas hits. And that Come On TV show, the way they did that was they'd actually record the singer with the band the day before, so they'd get the audio, and then the next day the singer would just mime in the studio to the recording they'd done. So it was them singing, but it wasn't live by any means. So it was all kind of fake and puffery.
But also hugely popular, right?
Hugely popular. I mean, people didn't have much choice of what else to watch. The funny thing was those sets were apparently amazing, like psychedelic-looking sets, but it was all in black and white. So they went through all the effort of actually painting it and getting a vibe, but no one ever got to see it.
So we're talking now about the kind of early 60s to probably the early 70s, which and if you go to an op shop now, you can find those things for nothing. It doesn't feel like there's much demand or reverence for a lot of those records, with the exception of that, that Ray Columbus album of originals that you described. At the same time, through the back half of that period, even though it wasn't called alternative music, you're starting to get the sense of a second track, this kind of wild aurora music that would eventually kind of become kind of garage music and psychedelia and then kind of funk. And I feel like the way that develops through the counterculture effectively is really is quite a fascinating era, and one that's kind of been less explored than the kind of DIY Flying Nun type stuff.
Yeah, well, it's difficult with a book like this because you want to adequately represent the time and what was important to people, and that was these bands doing cover versions. But then what legacy has that left? Who wants to hear their version of some great song from overseas when you can now hear the original so easily? So actually some of these bands that were quite obscure at the time, or tracks that weren't so successful by the La-Di-Das or Max Merritt or whatever, are the ones that people are interested in. So there was this kind of rediscovery, I guess, in the 80s and 90s with the John Baker compilations, where people were like, oh man, we had these crazy garage rock bands and they were super popular in their town, but when they went on TV, some of them got banned, like the Pleasers or whatever, who smashed all their percussion instruments and mucked around on TV, and that was, you're never coming back. That was the kind of scenario there. So it was in the 70s, I guess, the hippie thing came here really late, and that was when people really felt, oh, we have to do originals more.
So in terms of that sense of having two streams broadly, a kind of an established industry that wants to kind of basically just do the easy, obvious, popular thing, and this kind of nascent alternative type scene, radio felt like they were most of the emergent radio stations were very much in the first camp, and it did feel like there are some amazing episodes that you describe, for example, like Slice of Heaven, I think, which now you listen to it, you're like, this is canon, and yet it really struggled to get radio airplay at the time. Do you want to talk about the role that radio played and sort of didn't play in propagating New Zealand music in that kind of 70s, 80s era?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? In the book, I want to give that long-term perspective so people could see that change. And really, I mean, there was a very limited radio market when it was all nationalised and run through the government pretty much in the 60s. And then over the 70s, it was opened up to commercial interest. And so by the early 80s, it was an extremely competitive commercial market in radio. And so they just decided, the only safe thing to do is play overseas hits that we know are going to be hits, and here as well. And the other thing that happened was recording studios, just the production values went up in this weird way where there was all these gated snares and weird effects and stuff. So to sound like one of those acts was hugely expensive in the 80s. So it was a real struggle. But you did have the counterculture coming through with Rip It Up magazine and the rise of student radio. So that at least there was some counter to that. And the independent record labels that all sprung up at that time, that was kind of a reaction to radio just being disinterested, I guess.
When did that sort of start to change? Because for a long time, the commercial radio scene felt hostile to a lot of the kind of original New Zealand music that was coming out. Some of it wasn't interesting at all, but other times it would, have to go overseas, become a hit, that classic trajectory, and only then would it be anointed by local programmers. That felt like it persisted for a very long time, longer than you would expect, kind of looking back.
Yeah, I mean, you actually go back and realise some of it was actual effort by people to make that happen, and things that seem hokey now, maybe like NZ on Air or New Zealand Music Month, all these things were little bricks in the wall that sort of worked away at that over time and made it possible for local bands to compete. I think especially New Zealand on Air in those early years to be able to get on music TV, just as there was things like Cry TV and Christchurch and Max TV and overnight shows that played music videos on the mainstream TV was like really important. I mean, the craziest thing was early 2000s thinking of C4 now being on all day on the fourth biggest channel. It's like insane. It's like we had our own MTV that was so mainstream.
Yeah, and it was, I just remember coming home from school and that was just like the default, I'd watched Max TV in the 90s, but this felt like orders of magnitude because it was national and because it was so closely connected to Three. That was the youth channel. And that you also had Channel Z and that real flowering of just like a whole generation of both bands and particularly sort of hip-hop artists who had like multiple number one singles, and it felt like we'd just suddenly gotten over it being this kind of episodic thing, and now it became kind of routine, normal to expect our charts to have a huge thread of kind of of local music that sounded like it could have come from anywhere in some respects in terms of those production values that you talked about earlier.
Yeah, I mean, it was weird how there was a big gap that opened up because the student radio and Rip It Up scene and the Flying Nun scene found their own way in the world. Commercial radio were kind of separate in the 90s, and there was this gulf that happened, and it was really lucky, I think, that we had Channel Z and we had like Max TV and stuff who'd play stuff in the middle and give it a chance to cross over, because once, especially, I think once Kiwi FM took over and you didn't have Channel Z anymore, there was a gulf again. And
yeah,
so it was a weird period.
It was. And the Kiwi FM thing, I sort of hadn't really considered for a long time, but kind of disastrous in a lot of ways. You can see the sort of thinking and intention behind it. It was truly trying to capitalize on the rise of New Zealand music, but I think it overlooked the way that people listen to music.
I've got an article on Audio Culture about Chris Hoggard, and he was saying even at the time, you can't just give them this station, and they're kind of killing it on purpose because they just want the frequency back. So you've given them this frequency to do QFM, but with no rules on how long it should last and stuff. And so, of course, they just let it fall through the floor, and then they just put a more commercial station on there. So
what who drove that? Because it felt at the time like Channel Z was a big success. Like it kind of captured a youth music audience that was, headed much closer to the mainstream than BFM, but BFM both in terms of bands and to a lesser extent talent, but certainly in terms of local and international artists could function as a feeder to that was really important in terms of opening up that sort of big day out type music to national audiences. So
I don't get this deeply into things in the book, which is the whole raison d'etre of the book is to sort of go high level, but to give you what I recall is that Neil Finn in particular was pushing for us to get our own Triple J like they do in Australia and have it be a wing of national radio that was youth orientated and played maybe 50% local music or something like that. And the commercial radio stations were like, no way, we don't want to compete with that. And so they were like, how about we give you a station that only plays Kiwi music? And the government was like, oh, that's going to be a great headline. And so they went ahead with it, and I saw, the government appear at the launch and so forth. Yeah.
That's amazing. That's such a path not taken when you look back on it, because there was obviously an attempt to do a version of that much more recently, but by then the sort of horse had bolted and the brand couldn't be built and ended up getting yelled down by Concert FM fans anyway.
Yeah, well, it's a totally different situation now anyway. It would have only been a 10-year solution, but it would have been a great 10 years. I mean, that said, Triple J is still really influential in Australia because it's got all these sidelines that go along with it.
Well, it becomes a brand more than just a frequency, right? Another thing that's quite a thread through, particularly up until, honestly, till probably 2010, is the kind of artists going overseas and sometimes finding some success in Australia, more often struggling a bit. But any further afield, it was a real grind. People were dying, literally dying, and it did feel like the move beyond New Zealand was both, it sort of glittered as this thing that you really wanted to get to, but really, really punishingly difficult.
Well, that's what people in the modern world who complain about streaming perhaps forget, is that there were downsides to the CD era too. Even though it was great for a mid-level band if they could press 200 CDs and maybe make a couple of grand off that, it wasn't too hard a process. At the same time, if you wanted to go overseas and have people hear your music, you needed to get a CD in hundreds of stores. And how were you going to do that? How many people did you have to convince to get CDs in stores overseas? I know with Little Chief Records, we ended up just, we'd sign regions away to big labels overseas and hope we could just keep the label going, selling rarities or selling to the rest of the region. So brunettes would sell to Sub Pop or whatever, and then we'd get those CDs in those stores and have that backing over there. But then you lose all control of what's going on, and you have to spend huge amounts taking a band over there. I mean, $1,000 for each person's visa and then all the air flights and stuff. Compared, this American band's already there. They can just get in a van and tour. You've already spent $2,000 per member before you've even arrived. It's insane.
Yeah, and you're right that I do want to talk about the sort of streaming era, the sort of up and the downsides of it that the book kind of concludes on. Thinking about the label piece, Flying Nun is both a fascinating label, but also easily the most overcovered part of our industry. I say this as someone who's very excited to go see the Shane Carter documentary in a few weeks, but it's interesting because it has this it occupies this space in the national psyche, and it is so revered by generations of indie artists from overseas. You forget what a mess it was for probably from the kind of late 90s, maybe mid 90s through to for most of the 2010s, because it's feels much more on stable ground again now. But that period where it was owned by Mushroom, and it really sort of seemed to lose its identity entirely, right?
Yeah, well, I think it's great having all these in-depth books about every single that came out on Flying Nun or whatever, and I'll soak that up myself. I'll read a book like Needles and Plastic, but I think then you lose perspective, which is that, people start getting the idea that Flying Nun was this very niche label and everything on it was great, and it was just releasing like Straitjacket Fits and the Chills and everything was amazing. But then you actually go back and they'd release like 200 things a year, and some of it was terrible, and no wonder they were like struggling to have enough money to do the next release. They could never catch their own tail. And so it was great because it put down in audio form all these bands of that time. It's such an amazing catalogue, and it captures very obscure bands. But as a functioning label, there was no way it could survive and keep pressing records. The bigger acts would have to wait years before their albums came out and so forth. And so, progressively it started dealing with Mushroom and being bought out more and more. So and then it had acts like Straitjacket Fits signing to Slash or Chills signing a big American deal. And they sort of failed. Like, it was just bad timing. Like, it is in music, not because the music wasn't good, just because the timing wasn't great. Grunge had arrived, and so Straitjacket Fits were on the back foot, and so on and so forth. And so what do we tell ourselves about that? How do we tell that story in the perspective? What was the importance of Flying Nun? I think in a book like this, it seems more like a story about just inspiring New Zealanders to take music overseas, which seems so impossible, and showing these bands could get that first couple of feet into the room, maybe not blow up and get on the charts overseas. But I think that's how those acts in the 2000s and 2010s, like Naked and Famous, were probably thinking on a world stage from the start. And I know the Brunettes they were never their plan to stay in New Zealand. It was always like, let's go overseas. And I think Flying Nun laid that groundwork.
The JC Billboard Network delivers quality reach via commanding sites to ensure your campaign is visible and impactful. With superior screen quality and premium locations, JC can help your campaign be seen and be remembered. Visit www.beseenberemembered.co.nz to learn more. There's also, a whole other thread, and this feels much less well known, of the kind of Māori and Pacific labels that had probably a similar ethos to Flying Nun. Like, if we don't build it, there is no infrastructure, Dawn Raid being the most famous. But that period through the 90s and the 2000s in particular, and the long tail legacy of some of those artists is really vividly conjured in the book.
Yeah, I mean, to write a book like this, I had to focus mostly on original songwriting. That's why I put songs in the title, songs from the Shaky Isles. But even within that smaller field, there's a lot that often gets missed out from previous histories. And I think reggae is a massive one, because a lot of it happened out in the small towns in New Zealand. Like 1814 became massive before they ever could pack a venue in Auckland, probably. And all these summer festivals that started in the 2000s that focused on reggae made this whole other route to fame that you miss out on. And back in the 80s, as you say, there was like Warrior Records run by Hugh Lynn, who put Herbs out and put all those bands on the map. And that seemed to disappear in the 90s if you're in Auckland and you're not keeping an eye out. But reggae remained massive through the 90s, and weird acts like Defection had big reggae hits that charted. And so everyone was like, where's this reggae thing coming from in the early 2000s? But it's like, it's because you weren't there seeing it develop over that time.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Country and reggae both sort of loom as these big, not necessarily rural musics, but kind of regional musics that became, particularly in reggae's case, and maybe to a lesser extent latterly with country music, just so overwhelmingly dominant. Obviously 660 and LAB, but there was a whole kind of Wellington scene before that. And then in recent years, you got Corella and Fiji and so many different artists that might not have broached consciousness, but you can just feel that that is, in terms of what, if you're going to try and say what is a music that really kind of transfixes New Zealand at a population level, it's kind of hard to argue anything else.
Yeah, I find that whole story quite funny, and I feel like having the higher, more distant perspective that this book provides gives you more of a sense of how that might have happened. And for example, where did the Maori show bands go in the 70s? They were hugely popular, and then suddenly they all disappeared? No, they all became reggae musicians. Like Bob Marley came here, and the next thing you know, you had these reggae bands taking the same approach right through those decades. Catch a Fire spent years touring, just doing covers, finding this touring base around the small towns of New Zealand before they put out their first hit. Same with 1814. So, yeah, that same logic of the Maori show bands goes right through to those reggae bands. But I feel it's weird. People talk about barbecue reggae, and that's another thing I feel like this book can give a bit of perspective on, because it's weird. It throws together like Fat Freddy's Drop and stuff, which sounds completely different to this sort of good time reggae of 1814 or something. I just find it crazy that it all gets thrown in this pot together.
Yeah, it's reductive and dismissive and absolutely doesn't kind of capture the sense of, some of those artists were as trailblazing and as kind of sonically progressive as anything that came out of indie scenes. They just kind of, it wasn't necessarily for the people who were critiquing it potentially. There's a geography that you note that is quite interesting too. I think particularly like Christchurch as a kind of a centre for truly popular music, not solely that, but it feels like, particularly in the that sort of 2000s Channel Z, the kind of second big wave of New Zealand On Air funded artists, it massively outperforms its population base, and so many of the artists that really popped came out of that region.
Let's go through the names: Bikronga, Boronga, The Feelers, Zed, I guess, Op Shop,
Anika
Moore.
It's much more than you kind of like. If you were to look, I don't know how you'd sort of get the data on it, but it's kind of shocking. Well,
that's the funny thing. Like, I tried to make that case in my NZ Rock book back in whatever it was, 2010, but it was such a big book that you couldn't really see that trend. It just kind of got lost in this massive book that had way too much stuff in it. So I think things like that are a lot clearer in that book. And yeah, I feel like there was this weird thing where there wasn't an underground culture in Christchurch, which seemed to be a lot about dance music, I felt like, and the gathering and drum and bass and so forth. And so people who played guitar music were kind of freed to be like, oh, we'll just be a bit more mainstream. If we want to play in the bars, we have to play some covers. And there was a second wave, like all those cool 90s bands like Nirvana and Pixies had given way to these second wave sort of popular alternative bands. And so these bands had a place to pick up from where they'd make alternative rock, but it was a lot more geared towards commercial radio, I guess.
This is amazing. Like, I just kind of never clocked it at the time, but the fact the Feelers used the Pixies producer.
Yeah.
Like, whoa.
They loved all that stuff. They were probably shocked when they heard, turned on BFM and they were like, this is the worst band we've ever heard. It's like, no, it's because they've completely cleaned up this music you loved and served it back to you as the most poppy sort of rock you could possibly have, with electronic sounding drums and Paddy Free putting weird keyboard sounds on it, like real 90s.
Yeah, totally. And that was a whole thread with the likes of Blind Spot and Tadpole connected to that as well. Thinking about the streaming era, I have such a kind of, I don't know, I can never really figure out where to sit on it in terms of its impact, because you're right. If you look at the total quantum of our truly, like popular as in, hundreds of millions, if not billions of streams music, the vast bulk of it sits in the last sort of 10, 15 years. And yet, at the same time, it does feel like for artists that are coming up now, the sheer volume of music that's being released onto streaming platforms makes getting through to sort of a next layer like massively difficult. And certainly with that means that the sort of financial return on a quote unquote hit is much harder to kind of to figure out. What do you how do you view that the impact of streaming on, I guess, New Zealand's sense of its popular music? Because some of these, like they're huge hits, but they might have almost no visibility locally.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because, it's like the middle class getting wiped out or something. It's like this middle part of music really struggles now, and it is horrible to see. And it's got, I can make the case either way, really. In the book, I was probably overly positive just because I wanted to really acknowledge all the New Zealand music makers who've blown up in crazy ways, where it's the guy from Shouse or whatever having a billion streaming hit and no one hearing from him or whatever. But I could make the negative case as well. I guess the positive case is, like I said before, in the old days, record companies were so in control with CDs that they could do something like with the OMC hit, How Bizarre. They didn't release it as a single. That's why it didn't go to number one. They just made you buy the album. And so the album got to the top 40 in America because you had to get it to get the song. That's ridiculous. You have to spend $30 to buy a song. And so that allowed no one to feel guilty when there was illegal streaming. Everyone was illegal downloading. And that sort of set the price of music really low, and now streaming has come in to take advantage of music being worth nothing. The good part is, we can get our music everywhere, and we always hit above our weight when it comes to creative arts. And so some of our artists have done really well, and some of them have used it, like Stan Walker, in a way to become sort of role models for Te Reo Māori and taking that to the world and stuff. It's kind of interesting to watch him, who's a pop star, become almost a rebellious kind of figure in Māoridom, whereas Marlon Williams has become the kind of popular sort of Howard Morrison face of it a little bit. Not to be denigrating, but you need both sides to take things to the masses. The negative side, more obviously, is just the enshittification of all types of social media, which is, first, they are good for the user. And so Spotify was great when it first started. Then they want to be good to the advertiser. So Spotify starts, we've got to get podcasts on there because then we can do direct advertising. Then they've got to be good to the shareholder. And so they really start squeezing the advertiser. The advertiser starts getting nothing out of it. And you just go in there and it's a complete shit show. Meanwhile, you've also got bots who are just making all these fake playlists and stuff. And then little artists sometimes get kicked off because the people running these fake playlists have put them on a fake playlist to make it seem more real. They put some real artists on, and then their aggregator kicks them off the whole service. So it's this terrible thing where you're like, I know artists who've like rung up and go, where's my album gone? It's like, you were on a illegal playlist. It's like, well, I had nothing to do with that. Yeah. They were just trying to make it look legitimate. So
it's amazing what's been going on in Spotify in recent months. There's sort of AI generated artists putting out like an album a week, and artists having their sort of profiles taken over and with sort of AI generated music kind of put into their streams. And
that's why I think the big music story was probably like Chris Hockard and his co-owners selling DRM, because I think they saw how crappy the market was getting and stuff, and so they sold to the Orchard overseas. And it would have been a massive business deal, but it didn't seem to really get covered like that. But I think it was like a real sign of like smart people are backing away from this a little bit.
Yeah. Well, it's and it doesn't feel finished. I think you make that point in the book that this, just as radio and recorded music, it took decades to kind of cohere into sort of vaguely stable form. Streaming still is very new, and the with what Spotify is doing, I guess it does open up opportunities for a different approach.
Yeah, you never believe things will end. I'm sure in the height of MySpace, everyone would be like, MySpace is it. It's not going anywhere. So you never want to be the person predicting Spotify's going to last forever or whatever.
Yeah, and they've got, they put out, I think, as we record this, I think it was yesterday that they put out their most recent numbers, and they're pretty enormous companies. So I'm sure they're not going anywhere, but the sort of indifference to music that is radiating out of them now is quite profound. Lastly, before I let you go, the thing that's I'm kind of curious about, I think that because this is about popular music, so for the most part, it will have charted, through the period that there were charts for, or there'll be other kind of signals that tell you that it's happened. But in the streaming era, things can happen without, necessarily bothering the local charts. And I think we've all had that experience of sort of finding an artist that is domiciled here. Salvia Palth is one of the ones that you notice, who have got this, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of streams, yet feel sort of invisible to the sort of local industry. And that goes to the end of geography that streaming represents. How confident are you that you've caught everything, or that there's not some kind of strange band or producer out there who's racking up hundreds of millions of streams without your having come across your desk?
Well, it is always difficult, and I guess with this book, that was one of the good things about being high level, because when you get to the final chapter, you've got so many horses you could be betting on, and I did kind of just say, this is a historical book. I'm trying to give that perspective. And I felt cruel because a lot of those bands are my friends, as I say. I love Dick Move or whoever. I was listening to their new song this morning, and it was amazing. And they tour Europe and so on and so forth. But who's to say how successful they'll be, or whether they need to be in history or what? I need that chapter to be short. And so I made it shorter and shorter. The bands on Little Chief Records would probably be the most annoyed. It's like I work at the label, but I cut most of them out because I definitely didn't want to seem like I was like, pushing the field in one way or another for my own means. So, yes, there could be a new one every day. There's always someone like Ballo Brigada is the latest one, where someone's like, oh, did you hear they're touring with such and such in America, like 21 Pilots, I think it was. I was like, what? That band from Auckland? I thought they'd broken up. Like, I didn't realize they're in America being massive.
Half of Ballo Brigada was went out with someone who worked at Daylight, our sister agency. So I was kind of quite privy to their rise. But I think they moved to Berlin. But yeah, they've absolutely been on a tear lately. But again, because they're a New Zealand artist, and you made reference to the likes of Chelsea Jade, who aren't here anymore, and they're New Zealanders, but their sort of success, probably mirroring the likes of the Thompson twins, decades earlier, is on some level dislocated from whatever's happening in the local sphere.
Yeah, I mean, it's the fun things with books as well. This was finished, at least half a year ago, so you're always going to be at least that out of date. It's not like you can go like a website and quickly add someone in. So I just have to live with the old media that I've chosen.
Well, it's a very comprehensive and very readable history, and I really, really enjoyed that sort of, like you said, that high-level view of truly popular music from a million angles in New Zealand. So thank you, Gareth, for writing it and for coming up to talk about it on the phone.
Thanks for having me, Duncan. It was a fun chat.
Seeing is not enough. With optimized data tools and insights, the JC2Co Billboard network helps brands be remembered. Dedicated to closing the loop between impression and action, JC2Co can help your campaign be seen and be remembered. Visit www.beseenberemembered.co.nz to learn more.